On a quiet Sunday morning in Georgetown, Officer James Cooper does what he's done countless times before, lets his anger get the best of him. Known for his quick temper and excessive force, he stops an elderly man walking slowly down P Street, annoyed by the old man's deliberate pace. When the 92-year-old gentleman, wearing worn clothes and carrying a paper bag of groceries, doesn't move quickly enough for Cooper's liking, the officer shoves him to the ground. As bystanders record the shocking scene on their phones, Cooper smugly writes up a citation for disturbing the peace, completely unaware that he just assaulted Joseph Biden Sr., the president's father, who still insists on living modestly and doing his own shopping despite his son's position. What unfolds in the next 24 hours will shake the nation's conscience and force America to confront the growing crisis of police brutality in a way no one expected. Like and subscribe to follow this powerful story of how one moment of unchecked power leads to consequences that will change not just one officer's life, but an entire country's perspective on justice and accountability. Officer James Cooper was having a bad morning. His coffee was cold, his divorce papers had arrived yesterday, and now this old man was shuffling down the street like he owned it, completely ignoring Cooper's order to move faster. "Sir, I said pick up the pace," Cooper barked, his hand already resting on his baton. The morning sun glinted off his badge, number 4471, a badge that had 17 complaints of excessive force filed against it in the past year alone. The elderly man turned slowly, his kind blue eyes showing confusion rather than fear. "I'm sorry, officer. My hip isn't what it used to be. If you could just give me a moment." The paper bag in the old man's arms held simple items: bread, milk, a small container of butter. He'd insisted on doing his own shopping every Sunday morning for the past 50 years, even after his son had offered him a staff of helpers. "I don't have time for this," Cooper snapped, stepping closer. Several passers-by had stopped, phones already recording. "When an officer tells you to move, you move." "Son," the old man said gently, "there's no need for anger. We're all just trying to get through our day." Something about the old man's calm demeanor, his quiet dignity, made Cooper's anger flare hotter. Who was this old-timer to lecture him? He'd been on the force for 12 years. He knew how to handle people who didn't respect authority. Without warning, Cooper shoved the elderly man hard. The paper bag burst as it hit the sidewalk, milk spreading across the concrete like a white river. The old man fell heavily, his hip striking the curb with a sickening sound. "Now you're under arrest for disturbing the peace," Cooper announced, reaching for his handcuffs with practiced arrogance. "Oh my God!" a woman screamed from the growing crowd. "Someone call an ambulance! Do you know who that is?" Cooper smirked. "Don't care if he's the Pope. He needs to learn to respect." "That's Joseph Biden Sr., a man in the crowd shouted. "The president's father." Cooper felt the blood drain from his face. He looked down at the elderly man, really looked at him for the first time. The familiar features, the gentle eyes he'd seen in countless news photos. How had he not recognized him? "Someone get the White House on the phone," another voice called out, "and keep recording. The world needs to see this." Joseph Biden Sr. lay quietly on the sidewalk, making no attempt to move. His hip was certainly broken, but his dignity remained intact. He looked up at Cooper with something worse than anger, disappointment. "Young man," he said softly, "I hope you learn from this moment. Not because of who my son is, but because every human being deserves better than what you just did." Sirens were already approaching, not just ambulances, but the distinctive sound of Secret Service vehicles. Cooper stood frozen, his career and freedom crumbling around him as fast as the spilled groceries had hit the ground. Within minutes, the street was chaos. Secret Service agents swarmed the area. News vans appeared as if by magic. Cooper's radio crackled with his chief's voice. Officer 4471, what the hell did you just do? But it was the call coming into the chief's personal phone that would change everything. The president himself was on Air Force One, having just watched the viral video of his father being assaulted, and Joseph Biden Sr., still lying on that Georgetown sidewalk, looked at the young officer who'd attacked him and said something that would haunt Cooper forever. "I forgive you, son, but I pray you learn that power without compassion is the most dangerous force in the world." Within an hour, every major news network was showing the video. Cooper sat in his chief's office, watching himself on multiple screens as his moment of rage played over and over in an endless loop. 17 complaints, Chief Richardson said, reading from Cooper's file. 17 times people reported you for excessive force. I kept giving you chances because your arrest numbers were good. God help me, I'm as guilty as you are. Cooper stared at the floor, his swagger gone. On the TV, CNN was showing photos of Joseph Biden Sr. throughout the years, serving in World War II, raising his family as a single father after his wife's death, standing proudly at his son's presidential inauguration. "He refuses to live in Washington," a commentator was saying, "insists on staying in his modest home, doing his own shopping, says it keeps him humble, keeps him connected to regular people." The chief's phone hadn't stopped ringing. The mayor, the governor, the attorney general, everyone wanted answers. But it was the hospital updates that made Cooper's stomach turn. Mr. Biden's hip was indeed broken. At 92, such an injury could be life-threatening. "They're going to crucify you," the chief said quietly. "And I can't protect you this time. Don't want to, if I'm being honest. This isn't just about police brutality anymore. You assaulted the president's father, a World War II veteran, a man who lost his wife and daughter in a car crash and raised his boys alone. You couldn't have picked a more sympathetic victim if you tried." Cooper thought about his own father, who died when Cooper was young. The anger issues started after that, the fights at school, the counseling sessions his mother couldn't afford. He joined the police force thinking the uniform would give him control, would make the anger make sense. A commotion outside drew their attention. Protesters were already gathering, their signs telling Cooper's story in damning headlines. 17 complaints. Why was he still armed? Who did he hurt before the cameras were rolling? No one is safe when power goes unchecked. The chief's secretary knocked and entered quickly. "Sir, the president is about to make a statement from Air Force One." They turned up the volume. President Biden looked older than usual, the strain evident on his face. "This morning, my father, a 92-year-old veteran who survived World War II, who buried his wife and daughter, who worked his whole life to give his children a better future, was assaulted while buying groceries, not by a criminal, not by a terrorist, but by someone sworn to protect and serve." The president paused, visibly controlling his emotions. "Dad always taught us that real strength isn't about how much power you have, but how you use it. That true authority comes from respect, not fear. Today, we saw what happens when those entrusted with authority forget that lesson." Cooper felt tears running down his face as the president continued. "My father from his hospital bed asked me not to seek vengeance. Son," he said, "that young officer needs help more than he needs punishment. That's who my father is, a man who can look past his own pain to see the humanity in others, even those who hurt him." The chief muted the TV and looked at Cooper. "He's right, you know. You need help. Should have gotten it after the first complaint, definitely after the 5th, but we all looked the other way because it was easier." "What happens now?" Cooper asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You're going to be arrested. There's no avoiding that. The whole world saw what you did. But what happens after, that depends on whether you're ready to face what made you this way." Cooper nodded slowly, reaching for his badge with trembling hands. As he placed it on the chief's desk, he thought about Mr. Biden's words, "I forgive you, son." James Cooper's arrest was processed quietly through a back entrance of the police station, but nothing could silence the storm that was building outside. By evening, protests had spread to every major city. In his holding cell, Cooper watched on a small TV as thousands gathered in front of police stations nationwide. But they weren't just protesting him. His actions had become a tipping point, forcing the nation to confront a larger crisis. This wasn't an isolated incident, a civil rights leader said on the news. Officer Cooper had 17 documented complaints. How many others are still on the streets with similar records? How many incidents weren't caught on camera? His mother visited him that evening, her face worn with grief and worry. Martha Cooper had raised him alone after his father's death, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table. "Jimmy," she said softly through the cell bars, "what happened to you? You were such a gentle boy before your father died." Cooper couldn't meet her eyes. "I don't know, Mom. I got so angry all the time. The badge, the gun. They made me feel powerful when everything else felt out of control." "Your father would be heartbroken," she said. "He was a cop too, remember? But he never forgot what the badge really meant, to protect, to serve." The conversation was interrupted by his lawyer arriving with news. "They're charging you with assault, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. But there's something else. Mr. Biden wants to meet with you." Cooper looked up, startled. "Meet with me? Why?" "He insists, says he won't press additional charges, but he wants to talk to you face to face." The meeting was arranged for the next morning in the hospital. Under heavy security, Cooper was escorted to Mr. Biden's room. The elderly man lay in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he had on the street, but his eyes were still kind. "Sit down, son," Mr. Biden said, gesturing to a chair. "Let's talk about what happened yesterday." Cooper sat, shame burning in his chest. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness." "I already told you I forgive you," Mr. Biden interrupted gently. "But forgiveness doesn't mean there aren't consequences. What interests me is why. Why did you feel the need to hurt an old man who was no threat to you?" Something about the old man's gentle questioning broke through Cooper's defenses. For the first time, he spoke about his father's death, about the rage that had been building since childhood, about how the power of the badge had corrupted instead of healed him. Mr. Biden listened quietly, then shared his own story, about losing his wife and daughter, about the anger he'd felt, about choosing to channel that pain into raising his boys with love instead of bitterness. "Pain either breaks us or transforms us," the old man said. "The choice is ours, but when we wear a badge, carry a gun, that choice affects everyone around us." As Cooper left the hospital room, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not for escaping punishment. He knew he deserved whatever consequences came, but hope that maybe, finally, he could face his demons and become the man his father would have wanted him to be. The trial became a national spectacle. Every day, Cooper sat in the defendant's chair watching video after video, not just of his assault on Mr. Biden, but body cam footage from his previous incidents that had been swept under the rug. A teenage boy he'd pushed against a wall for looking suspicious. An elderly woman he'd made cry during a traffic stop. A deaf man he'd tackled for refusing to follow commands he couldn't hear. The defendant shows a clear pattern of escalating violence, the prosecutor said. Each incident emboldened him further, leading inevitably to the assault on one of our nation's most respected citizens. But it was the testimony of Joseph Biden Sr. that changed everything. Against his doctor's advice, he insisted on appearing in person, using a walker to make his way to the witness stand. "I look at Officer Cooper," the old man said, "and I see someone's son, someone's child who lost his way. Yes, he must face consequences for his actions. But if we just punish without trying to understand, without trying to help, we're failing as a society." He turned to look directly at Cooper. "Young man, I've lived through a world war. I've buried a wife and a daughter. I've seen humanity at its worst and its best. The moment you pushed me down, you showed me your worst. Now show me your best. Show me you can learn, can change, can grow." Cooper's own testimony came next. For the first time, he spoke publicly about his struggles with anger, about using his badge as a weapon instead of a shield. "I didn't just fail Mr. Biden," he said, his voice breaking. "I failed every person I was sworn to protect. I failed my fellow officers who wear the badge with honor. Most of all, I failed my father's memory. He was a police officer too, one who served with dignity until the day he died." The verdict was never in doubt. Cooper was found guilty on all charges. But before sentencing, something unprecedented happened. Police chiefs from across the country submitted a joint statement to the court. "Officer Cooper's actions reflect a systemic failure," they wrote. "Not just his personal failure, but our failure as leaders to identify and address troubled officers before tragedy strikes. We request that any sentence include mandatory counseling and a program for Cooper to share his story with police cadets, to show them firsthand the cost of unchecked power." The judge took everything into consideration: the severity of the crime, Mr. Biden's wishes, the possibility of redemption. His sentence reflected both justice and mercy: 5 years in prison, mandatory counseling, and upon release, Cooper would work with police training programs to prevent others from following his path. As he was led from the courtroom, Cooper passed Mr. Biden in his wheelchair. The old man reached out and caught his hand. "Remember," Mr. Biden said softly, "it's never too late to become the person you should have been all along." 5 years later, James Cooper stood before a class of police cadets at the academy. His prison uniform had been replaced by civilian clothes, his anger by humility. "Take out your phones," he told them. "Look up the video of what I did that Sunday morning. Watch it, remember it, because that's what happens when power corrupts, when a badge becomes a weapon instead of a shield." He visited police academies across the country now, part of a new program focused on preventing abuse of power. But first, he'd had to heal himself. The mandatory counseling in prison had forced him to confront his demons, to understand why his father's death had twisted him into someone who hurt others. Joseph Biden Sr. had survived his broken hip, though he now used a wheelchair. He and Cooper had developed an unlikely friendship through letters during Cooper's imprisonment. The old man had become the mentor Cooper desperately needed. "How do you face them?" a cadet asked during the Q&A. "The people you hurt before. How do you make it right?" Cooper took a deep breath. "One day at a time. I found as many as I could, apologized. Some forgave me, some didn't. I had to accept that I can't undo what I did. I can only try to prevent others from making the same mistakes." After each session, he visited his father's grave. "I get it now, Dad," he would say. "What you tried to teach me about the badge, about serving others instead of dominating them." His mother had kept every newspaper article about his case, but now she also kept the stories about his work with cadets, about the changes his case had inspired in police departments nationwide. The incident had indeed sparked reform. Complaint tracking systems were overhauled. Mental health screening for officers became mandatory. The blue wall of silence began to crack as more officers spoke up about colleagues who showed warning signs. On the 5th anniversary of that Sunday morning, Cooper received a letter from Mr. Biden. "Dear James, they tell me the program you started has reached over 10,000 cadets. That's 10,000 future officers who might think twice before letting power corrupt them. That's 10,000 chances to prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else. You asked me once why I forgave you. The answer is simple: because holding on to anger only creates more anger. By choosing forgiveness, we create space for change. Your father would be proud of the man you've become, not despite your mistakes, but because of how you've learned from them. Keep teaching, keep sharing, keep reminding them that true strength lies not in how much power we have, but in how wisely we use it. With faith in your continued journey, Joseph Biden Sr. Cooper folded the letter carefully and placed it in his wallet next to his most treasured possession, a photo of his father in uniform, smiling proudly on his graduation day from the academy. That evening, he stood before another class of cadets, ready to share his story again. But first,